Good afternoon, good evening. Great to have you all here today. I am Janice Kaminer Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of our leadership team, which, aside from myself, includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. We welcome and thank tonight's special guest, Norman Ornstein, a lifelong student and teacher and a keen observer of politics, elections, and the United States Congress. There are few analysts more qualified to bring important insights to tonight's topic, Trump and the GOP, a guide for the perplexed. Welcome and thank you as always to tonight's moderator, Larry Mantle. In the coming week, we have two programs. On Monday night, May 6th at 5 p.m., we will host our 13th Israel and Crisis briefing with our guest Ambassador Dennis Ross, who will be in conversation with Pat Morrison. He's highly qualified to talk about the subject, having spent almost 40 years doing diplomacy on behalf of the U.S. in the Middle East. And then next Wednesday, a week from tonight, we host two very highly respected pollsters, Celinda Lake and Paul Maslin. We're all very attuned to and curious about polls and their reliability. So you'll want to be sure to tune in for that program. They will be in conversation with Warren Olney on the topic political polling, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Tonight, with all of the campus-related protests, before we start our program with Dr. Ornstein, we'll have a brief update about the situation at UCLA. We are fortunate that my colleague, Zev Yaroslavsky, has not only been an important pivotal LA elected official for the last 40 years, but he has spent the last several years as a faculty member at UCLA, where he continues to serve this quarter. And he is certainly in an excellent position to bring us all up to date. He has agreed to have a brief conversation with Larry Mantle at the top of the program to update our audience on the situation. Larry, of course, as you all know, is an award-winning talk show host with the longest-running talk show in Southern California, Air Talk with Larry Mantle. He's been with NPR's affiliate, LAist, for decades and is a frequent America at a Crossroads moderator. I now turn our program over to Larry Mantle. Larry?
Thank you, Janice. I appreciate it so much. One of the things I love about doing these America at a Crossroads programs is hearing from where all the viewers are throughout the United States and around the world, to think that in the time these programs have been produced by Jews United for Democracy and Justice, to think of the reach that they've gained because of the outstanding guests, because of the important conversations. It always makes it an honor for me to participate in the programs. We are going to start, as Janice said, on this other topic. I think for many of us in Los Angeles, this is a painful day. The violence overnight at UCLA was shocking, as multiple protesters were injured after being struck by objects and sprayed with chemical irritants. There's been criticism of the university's leadership from just about every quarter. Just a couple of hours ago, the LA Times reported UC President Michael Drake is ordering an independent review of the university's planning, actions, and law enforcement response to last night's violence. So with this in mind, we wanted to get Zev's thoughts about it as someone who is a part of the UCLA community and has been so for many years. Zev, I understand you were up through the night. You were watching the live stream of LA news coverage of what was unfolding. Just what were your thoughts as you were seeing this taking place on a campus that you love?
Well, Larry, as you know, I'm an alumnus, a two-time alumnus of UCLA. I got my undergraduate and graduate degree there over 50 years ago. And when I saw what was transpiring, and I had been on the campus earlier this week, I saw the encampment. To see the violence there was heartbreaking. The violence was provoked that was provoked last night, I think, is one of the darkest moments in the university's history. It's a great university. I'm very proud to be a UCLA Bruin. And to see what had devolved in the main quad of the campus just broke my heart. I haven't gotten over it yet. This problem didn't start last night, and I don't want to assess blame or even suggest blame. Everybody's quick to point fingers. I think there needs to be an investigation about what went wrong here, and it didn't start, as I said last night. The encampment was allowed there. It was in violation of almost a dozen university regulations. It blocked access to the main library. This is midterms week at UCLA. Students couldn't get to the library without going all the way around. It was a horrendous thing. There's been vandalism, graffiti, and hate graffiti and political graffiti on Royce Hall, which is the iconic building of the university. It's the landmark building at the university. And so this has been going on now for a week or so. And then last night there was a provocation. Some outsiders, not clear who they are yet, but I'm sure we're going to find out, came in with the intent to start a conflagration, and they did. And it evolved very quickly into firecrackers being launched into the encampment, people throwing stuff into and out of the encampment, etc. It was a terrible, the optics were terrible, but the substance was terrible also. And
Zev, you had email communication with your students today because you had a scheduled guest lecturer, I understand. What did your students tell you about what they were experiencing?
I think my students are this quarter. They're graduate students. They're public policy students. They're paying good money to get, I hope, a good course. They were not happy. I'm sure they weren't happy about having the class canceled today, but they're traumatized, as we all are, to see, to experience what went on there, even if you weren't physically there. But it's part of your DNA, and to see the main quad of the university turn into a riot zone, and without law enforcement there. It took 2 hours once they were called in, as I understand it. Once they were called in, it took 2 hours for the law enforcement to show up. So there were people getting hurt on both sides of the conflagration, and there were practically speaking no police. Once the police arrived there, the California Highway Patrol was involved, the LAPD, the UC police themselves. It got tamped down very quickly, and it once that happened, it was resolved without incident. But what happened in the 2 hours that preceded that was quite an incident. And so my students were, I offered them an opportunity today to have the class on Zoom, and there was a division of opinion, and not a philosophical one, but people who just didn't have the desire, or they couldn't concentrate on anything today, and so I just canceled. The university canceled the class. I canceled my optional opportunity, and just asked everybody to take it easy, and we'll reconvene next week, hopefully.
Just real quickly to close, Zev, you mentioned you support what UC President Drake is calling for, the investigation. What would you like to see UCLA do beyond that, if anything, in response to last night?
That's a tough question. They've declared the encampment an unlawful assembly, and the university has given through the weekend for the encampment to be vacated. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. It's not going to be necessarily easy, but I think the encampment has to go, or at least modified. I mean, it's ridiculous. If you know the campus, and some of the Angelinos here will know the campus. Royce Hall is a major auditorium. It's a classroom building. The main library of the university is right across the quad from it. People can't get through there, can't get across the campus without doing a significant detour. It's not sustainable. The second thing I'd like to see is I'd like to get to the bottom of what happened. This is the public official in me. I'd like to understand what happened. How did it get to the point where it appears that we weren't prepared? And once we got the mutual aid activated, bringing the police from other jurisdictions onto the campus, why did it take 2 hours to do that? And by the way, what's ironic about this is the people who are generally not very pro-police, who believe in defunding the police or reducing the police and not having a police department on the campus at all of a sudden are very interested in having the police when they're getting hurt. And they're right. There needs to be a public safety presence on campus when something like this happens. So I'd like to find out what went wrong on that. And the whole the whole planning, this didn't happen in a vacuum. There's been a lot going on for months on campuses all over the country because of the Israel-Gaza situation, and there, you know, how do you prepare? How do you inoculate yourself against something that will impede the academic mission of the university, which is the principal mission of the university, is to teach and to have respectful academic discussion. Look, I'll just conclude with this, Larry, because my good friend Norm Ornstein is much more interesting than I am at this point. But I told my students, I sent them a message this morning, is the inability to resolve our differences in a civil and mutually respectful manner is the greatest threat to our society and to our democracy. And that UCLA's Royce Hall Quad became the epicenter, one of the epicenters for this unraveling last night, is heartbreaking to me as an alumnus of that school. We've got to learn, and this is not going to happen overnight. We've got to learn how to respect each other, even if we have profound tension-creating differences. You can't resort to violence because that's a slippery slope to you know what.
Zev, thanks very much. Appreciate
Thank
you
you, Larry.
starting us off with your perceptions of what happened last night and has been happening for several days preceding it at UCLA. And now to the scheduled topic and our guest of the evening. Norman Ornstein has spent decades teaching, studying, and writing about American politics, elections, and Congress. He's Senior Fellow Emeritus of the American Enterprise Institute and is regularly published in The Atlantic and The New Republic, among other magazines. He's also co-directed the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project and has written or co-authored numerous books, including It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. And Norm is here with us this evening to analyze the current Republican Party and Donald Trump's leadership of it. Good evening, Norm.
Great to be with you and everybody from around the country and elsewhere, Larry.
Norm, let's start taking the theme of what Zev was just talking about.
Yeah.
As a political scientist, what do you think, if any, the impact will be 6 months from now in the election of not just the pro-Palestinian protests, but the conflict we've seen at Columbia, at Cal Poly Humboldt, now at UCLA, at several campuses?
And all across the country, Larry. Of course, up till now, the epicenter has been Columbia. We've also seen, really bad things happen at a lot of the other Ivy League schools, the University of Michigan, the University of Wisconsin. We've had a police presence. We've had violence in other places. There's nothing good about this for the reasons that Zev suggested. It's just a terrible thing for the country when you can't deal with differences in a respectful fashion. But what we also know is that this broader set of issues, the conflict in the Middle East, is having an impact on the election itself. Now, we know that things change, that oftentimes the half-life of any issue is relatively short because new things will emerge. But what I can tell you is that when you have this kind of division and conflict, it's not good for an incumbent president, no matter what. And what we also know is that in an election where let's face it, the presidential election is going to come down to 7 or maybe 8 states, the ones that decided the election in 2016 and in 2020. It's going to be decided basically by 2 groups of voters: a Democratic Party base, which needs to be at least as energized as the Republican base, which, as we know, when Donald Trump said in 2016, I could shoot somebody in broad daylight on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose a vote. He can be convicted in multiple places of horrible offenses and won't lose that base. And if Democrats are not turning out for Biden, that's a big problem. And then we've got those, call them swing voters, mostly in these states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, maybe even Minnesota. It's the suburban college-educated voters, Republicans and independents, who don't much like Biden, but despise Trump. And I'm concerned about third parties, but I'm also concerned that these conflicts are going to turn people even more against President Biden. So resolving the Middle East is important, but we also have to get well past these kinds of divisions on campuses, and we're not there yet.
I just want to remind our viewers that you can ask Norm questions about American politics, about Congress, about elections in our Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you've never asked a question before, it's a very easy process. Please include your first name, and if you wouldn't mind, the location from where you're asking your question. It's nice to know where the question's coming from and the first name of the person asking it. Again, please do that in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Norm, Republican members of Congress have framed the protests as awash in anti-Semitism, with equating Zionism with being genocidal and oppressive. The Republican members of Congress have accused the colleges of tolerating behavior against Jewish students that never would have been tolerated against any other group. And I'm wondering, is that likely to have much of an effect on Jewish voters? Trump, according to AP, got, I think it was about 30% of the Jewish vote 4 years ago. Is that in play as a result of what's happening now?
I'm very skeptical of that, Larry, for a couple of reasons. The Republican Jewish coalition has had this dream for decades. It's a little bit like waiting for the Messiah to come, that Jews would finally turn against Democrats because of the Republican strong support for Israel. And it hasn't happened. The Jewish support for Republicans has been right around 25 to 30% for a long time. And I don't frankly see that changing. I am a little worried about some, especially these younger Jewish progressives, maybe deciding that they will vote for a Cornel West or a Jill Stein, or even, as I shudder, RFK Jr. And I suspect we're going to see especially Stein and West trying to veer to the left to try and pull them over. But Republicans or others who are going to spurn Joe Biden because he hasn't done enough to stop anti-Semitism, no. And I want to add one other thing, Larry. Every one of, as I watched Elise Stefanik, for whom I have deep contempt, as she excoriated the presidents of Harvard and Penn, about anti-Semitism. This is the same woman, as is the case with every one of the Republicans now railing about anti-Semitism, who said nothing when Donald Trump had lunch with Nick Fuentes, who is a genuine neo-Nazi calling for the extermination of Jews. Most of them said nothing when Trump referred to very fine people who were saying Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville. So the hypocrisy here is just extraordinary, and I don't see it changing very many votes. And, reflecting on a broader point here too, these are Republicans who have railed against the cancel culture. And it's understandable that you want to have robust and free discussion on campuses and elsewhere. They're now trying to tamp that down. And let's face it, the First Amendment is not about nice speech that makes everybody feel happy. It's about speech that makes you feel uncomfortable. I'm not happy with any university presidents for the way they've handled all of this. Frankly, it's reflected really badly on university administration across the country. They weren't prepared for how they could deal with this, put some boundaries in place to have robust and civil discussion without having it descend into anarchy. But there's hypocrisy here that is just hard to take.
Norm, my understanding is within recent days, Stanford had a program that they put on bringing together different voices on the Middle East. And it sounds like the program actually went off well. I haven't talked with anyone who attended it, but I've just seen social media reports on it. Does it give you hope that in this highly polarized time around the Middle East that might be possible?
I certainly hope so. And I think that will become a model and a template. We've seen other universities that have managed to deal with this kind of conflict with a, deep-seated emotional views of others much better. They've been able to have an expression for those who are really upset with Israel and Gaza, while also keeping it from descending into something much worse. The University of Chicago is another very good example. I hope we'll see some calibration here, and I hope we're going to see a different kind of dialogue as time passes. But, this conflict is not over, and we don't know how it's going to proceed or end. And right now, I hope that this is a wake-up call, not just for universities and university presidents, but more broadly across the society. In a larger sense, Larry, our politics over the last 40 years or more have moved towards tribalism. And it's not just polarization with our parties, it's tribalism. I could take it back to Newt Gingrich, who helped to create this, to the rise of tribal media. But what we also know is that the norms of conduct have declined dramatically. There's hardly a day that goes by when I don't refer to a seminal idea and piece by my late friend and mentor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, called Defining Deviancy Down. That when you have norms of behavior, and if you violate them, there's shame, and you begin to lose those norms, that becomes the new normal. And let's face it, racism used to be something, if you accuse somebody of it, it was a terrible thing. Now it's right out in the open. Anti-Semitism used to be on that same par. Now we have open anti-Semites and neo-Nazis who say things and do things and get involved in horrible behaviors, and there seem to be limited consequences. There have to be consequences, and we have to reestablish those norms. And right now, it's very hard to do. One would have hoped that with the conflict in the Middle East and what's happening around the country, that both parties, which would have occurred decades ago, would have come together to try and move this from involving violence or terrible things happening. And that's not occurring. It's now used as a political wedge.
Norm, let's talk about what our theme is for tonight. That is Trump's control of the Republican Party at this point. A just released NPR poll shows that Trump has also made progress among voters under 45. He and Biden are essentially tied now in that demo. I know we're 6 months away. We don't want to, next week there's going to be a whole program devoted to how accurate is polling. Nonetheless, that has to be concerning for the Biden re-election campaign. Biden easily won the group of under 45 voters 4 years ago. What do you think is going on?
I'm a little skeptical of these polls for reasons that we'll see your two terrific pollsters among the best we have discussing next week. But I think there's no question that there's been some erosion of support. Now, I think some of this, and something we also have to keep in mind, the vast majority of Americans are not paying the kind of attention that you and I and the thousands of participants in this call pay to what's going on. They're living their lives. There are a lot of young voters who are caught up with other things, but who also are getting their information from sources that are not the ones that we would prefer that they have. And they're getting a distorted view of what's going on out there in the world. And one question is whether the Biden campaign is going to be able to deal with this and deal with it effectively. I think, dealing with that larger issue, what it also means is that the vast majority of American voters don't have any clue what Donald Trump would do in a second term. And one part of this is that people look in the rearview mirror in a distorted way. There are a lot of voters out there who think, it was easier. We didn't have this trouble when Trump was president, ignoring what the reality was then. And now there's all kinds of turmoil. And frankly, the Republicans in Congress who have created a lot of gridlock, a lot of controversy, who continue to do so, know that when we have things like that, when it looks like Washington isn't working, people blame the incumbent president. They don't look at who's actually behind it. And now I think what we're seeing is with Donald Trump, this in-depth interview, the transcript is out there, the full transcript that Eric Corteliza
Time
of Time
Magazine
Magazine
one.
just did with Donald Trump, where he himself is telling us what he would do in a second term. What we know from people who were close to Trump in his first term, people like the former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, his former chief of staff, people from the Joint Chiefs, people from Homeland Security have said about what he wanted to do in his first term and what they stopped. And Trump now saying that the biggest mistake he made was that he was too nice, that he wouldn't bring back people like that. Things that we know that Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon have said that are now coming directly out of Trump's mouth. A reimposition of the Muslim ban, rounding up with the military and nationalized National Guards, especially from red states, 12 million or more, as he calls them, illegals, undocumented people, including many who've been in this country for decades, putting them in detention camps, make that concentration camps before deporting them, having an administration built around retribution, using the Insurrection Act to invoke the military against protests he didn't like, and having violence as a part of what he would do, saying that violence is not out of the question if he loses no matter what. All of that, plus, of course, blowing up our alliances with NATO, giving Russia a free hand to invade NATO countries, basically signaling to China that Taiwan is not anything that we're going to care about it anymore, pulling the troops out of South Korea, chaos in the world. And I think most people have not grasped what that would mean. And right now, there's also an emotional reaction against Biden.
Norm, I have to say, though, the people that I talked to who were Trump supporters, when you raise all those issues, it really doesn't connect with them. And they feel like that's overblown. That's a narrative that comes from left-wing media. They just think that it's hyperbolic. So if you really think that people reading the Time Magazine transcript that is going to sway them, what leads you to believe that would be the case?
I don't think that it's going to sway any Trump supporters. I'm not going to suggest that the 40% of the electorate who will be with Trump no matter what, who may brush it off or basically say that would be fine because he's going to deal with our enemies who are trying to destroy our way of life. Write them off. They're not going to change. The question is whether Democrats, who now, in many instances, emotionally, because of what's happening with Gaza, are saying, I can't vote for Biden. That includes all those Muslim Americans in Michigan and Dearborn. It includes an awful lot of younger voters on the campuses, whether they will understand what the stakes are for them and for the country, and whether those suburban voters who don't much like Biden are going to understand that a vote for anybody else is a vote for the end of American democracy. And the burden is on all of us, and the burden is on the Biden campaign to make that case. And you don't have to make that case by saying, trust us. You can make it with what he says, much of it on video, but also in other places.
Norm, let's talk about with the double haters, the people you're talking about, some Democrats and some independents who just neither candidate is going to connect for them. They now, in some states, are going to have a place to go with RFK Jr. In California, as you pointed out on Twitter, he is running under the banner of the American Independent Party. He's going to be an option for people. How significantly do you think he has the ability, particularly in the states in play, to draw voters and affect the outcome?
You know, we've seen that Donald Trump is now attacking RFK Jr. out of a fear that he will pull some Republican votes. I actually think that there's significant evidence, including a big in-depth study of 18 to 29-year-olds, that the biggest danger is he will pull votes that otherwise might go to Joe Biden. It's for a couple of reasons. There are a lot of younger voters who use the same sources of information on TikTok and elsewhere, spreading conspiracy theories, anti-vax stuff, that are buying into it. There are also voters who don't understand that RFK Jr. is not RFK, that he is still a part of that Kennedy mystique and Kennedy magic. What we're seeing now is that, of course, virtually the entire Kennedy family, his siblings and his other relatives, have turned against him, believe that he has gone completely lunatic. But we also know the American Independent Party, which has endorsed him now, which has put him on the ticket in California, is a right-wing lunatic party that originally was a standard bearer for George Wallace when he was at his racist worst, and then became the standard bearer in the presidential campaign of a congressman from Orange County, John Schmitz, perhaps best known now as the father through an affair of Mary Kay Letourneau, who, of course, went to jail for having a relationship with her young student who she then married. But John Schmitz was a John Birch Society member and a member of the far right. And this is a party that is the far right party. He's on the ballot in Michigan, which is more significant in presidential terms, obviously, because it is very much in play with another party that harbors people from radical forces. So the case has to be made that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is not Robert Kennedy and does not represent values that would be respected by people in the middle or on the left. But that still doesn't mean he isn't going to attract some votes. And remember, Larry, these states like Michigan, they're going to be decided at the margins. We may be talking about 10, 20, or 30,000 votes. Hillary Clinton lost Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin by fewer votes than Jill Stein, who was, of course, feted by Vladimir Putin and was on the green ticket, won in those states. So we have to be concerned that even if they get marginal votes, candidates like RFK Jr. can have a very deleterious impact.
Norm, just a total piece of trivia. My recollection is that John Schmitz was actually thrown out of the John Birch Society for being extreme, which I don't know how you do that, but I think he accomplished that at one point.
That may have been his greatest accomplishment.
Let's talk about what the Republican Party is now, because pre-Trump, there were segments of the GOP that had different priorities. You had evangelical conservatives for whom social issues were paramount. You had fiscal conservatives who were most concerned about the size of the federal debt and concerned about free market priorities. You had a variety of different segments of the party. With Trump's consolidation, what happened to those people? Do they exist anymore? Where have the fiscal conservatives gone? Because Trump certainly did not, that was really not part of his presidency. Where have the free marketers gone? Because he's a protectionist. Where have those people found refuge?
And also, where have the anti-communists gone? The Republican Party has become a party that loves Vladimir Putin. And I think it would be safe to say that Ronald Reagan would be spinning in his grave at that particular outcome as well. A lot of things have happened. There are a couple of points that we need to make, Larry, which is that the malign forces that Trump represents, and he's an accelerant of a process that was going on long before he emerged on the scene. Those malign forces go back many decades. They include people who rallied around Father Coughlin back in the 1930s, when he was the early equivalent of Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson, spewing on the radio vicious, racist, and anti-Semitic bile, but got a lot of followers. The Republican Party struggled in the 1940s as the more populist radicals, led by Robert Taft back then, almost seized the mantle of the Republican Party. We've had isolationist forces. We've had forces that were more comfortable with dictators than with small d Democrats. struggling for a long time and have gained more traction. Now, I think what's happened first is the Republican Party has basically evolved into a cult. It is not a traditional party anymore, a party that not only looks to win elections, but looks to solve problems, that understands that in the American political system, compromise is a core part of it. It's a cult, and before Donald Trump, it was a cult without a leader in the same way. And how do we distinguish a cult? Members of a cult are motivated by the fear of being shunned or excommunicated, or suffering violence if they go against the creed of the cult. And in a cult also, when you have a leader, if the leader changes course and even reverses field, people go along and accept the new mantra. And that's what we've seen. So just as an example, when Liz Cheney said that on the floor of the House, when they voted to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th, that 100 or more Republican members came up to her and said, "We know you're right, Liz, but we can't do it." They can't do it because they feared being shunned by their friends, by being beaten in a primary, by being threatened, as we have seen happen. One of my friends in the Republican Party, somebody I worked with for a long time, House Republican named Fred Upton, was the chair of the Commerce Committee for a period, voted for that impeachment, and he and his wife Amy got credible death threats as a consequence. He retired. Lots of them have gone. Now they don't know where to go. They don't feel like they have a home, a lot of them.
Well, and I was specifically wondering though, Norm, about voters, and maybe the large majority of American voters aren't truly ideological. Maybe it is more of a tribal connection to the party they grew up with, or the familiarity with it. Maybe most voters don't vote that way. But ideologically, where did those other Republican voters go?
So certainly you have some, those who are deeply engaged in the world and the process, who really feel like they don't have a home now. There are things about the Democratic Party that they're not happy with, but they don't have a home in the Republican Party. Now, having said that, we know from a lot of studies, from especially my political science colleague, Alan Abramowitz at Emory University, that voters are now more motivated by what he calls negative partisanship than anything else. You can believe that a lot of your party has gone astray, but if you feel like the other side is the enemy trying to destroy your way of life, if you believe, as a lot of voters do about Donald Trump, that whatever else he does, he sticks it to those liberals who we don't like. If you believe that if you criticize him, then you're giving aid and comfort to the enemy, then you're going to see a lot of the dynamic played out the way we have seen it now. We have an interesting question. The voters that you're talking about, we know as we went through Republican primaries that 15% or so pretty consistently, including even just a week or two ago in Pennsylvania, where they had a late primary, voted for Nikki Haley or voted against Donald Trump, even though it was clear he was going to be the nominee. Is there a likelihood that that 15% will decide that Trump is obnoxious enough that they'll vote instead for Joe Biden? I doubt it very much, because when they end up in November, it's more likely that tribalism will take over. Now, again, we talk about votes at the margins. Is it possible, especially if Trump gets convicted in New York, if we have other trials, if some of those voters, given the Dobbs decision and the way in which we're seeing in states, Florida now enacting what is close to being the most draconian program, a 6-week ban, which means basically no abortions. If we see and get more evidence that this Project 2025, closely linked to the Trump campaign, run out of the Heritage Foundation, that has said explicitly, it starts with abortion, then it goes to contraception, then it goes to gay marriage, then it goes to gay sex, then it goes to premarital sex. If there is some sense that this is actually a set of things on the table, maybe more of those voters decide that it's just too much. It's a bridge too far to vote for Republicans.
Norm, before we go to viewer questions, there are many good ones I want to bring up, but just real briefly, to what extent, and I should mention Arizona's legislature today repealed that 19th century near total ban on abortion. So now I think they have a 15-week one that is operative at this point moving forward. To what extent are these restrictions on abortion going to benefit Democrats in November?
I think it's a big secret weapon for Democrats. We've seen it operate, obviously, in the midterm elections in 2022, where Democrats dodged a major bullet. Even though they lost the House, they kept and even expanded a bit their margin in the Senate. They won state legislatures at a time where that normally would not happen. We've seen it occur in special elections since, including, by the way, in one that just took place in New York, a congressional seat that was vacant, in a district that was nominally about 7% in favor of Democrats, where the Democrat won by 36%. Now, the argument against that is these are the most active voters in the lower turnout elections. What will happen in a larger one? But I think the radical moves that we're seeing in so many states, even with 15-week bans, they're making it extremely difficult. We're seeing in so many of these states that doctors and nurses and hospitals are cowed because often the laws are ambiguous enough, even if they allow for some exceptions, that you're forced as a doctor to choose between your Hippocratic oath and the possibility of going to jail when a woman is bleeding in front of you and perhaps even bleeding to death. So I think it's going to matter for those college-educated suburban voters. And I think it is really going to be a pivotal thing in a lot of these states. And it's incumbent upon Democrats and incumbent upon those who do not want to see our democracy disappear under Trump, who do not want to see this most radical element driven by the religious fundamentalists take over to make that case.
Norm, we have several viewers, including Leslie in Mission Hills, who asked for your thoughts on why we're seeing the rise of these protests on campus now, particularly with 6 months to go with the presidential election, raising the issue of whether part of this is in some way ginned up by Russian or Chinese or Iranian interests. Do you think that there is any of that at play, or is this largely driven by students?
I think it's both, Larry. I think there's little doubt that we're seeing outside forces from abroad and here at home who are trying to make this in a bigger conflict on campuses and elsewhere. But there's certainly a lot of emotion on those campuses and among young people. And that includes some of the younger generation of Jews. You know, there was a very interesting piece by somebody who I don't find often has interesting pieces, a columnist in the New York Times, Ross Douthat, who wrote that he looked at the core curriculum at Columbia. Most of these elite universities have eliminated core curricula. People don't have to take classics or, learn stuff that used to be a standard. And he said there was a lot there going back. If you were at Columbia as an undergraduate, you have to read Plato and Aeschylus, and you have to look at a lot of the classic literature and the classic ideas. But he said, when you look at what's on the core curriculum for the late 20th century, it's all about colonialism. And the frame that a lot of young voters have is about the horrors of colonialism, not really going back to, England, Belgium, Holland, and others in the 19th century, the 18th century, with all the horrible things that they did, but in more modern times, and Israel's become a focus of that. And for an awful lot of young voters, what's happened in Gaza has triggered this deeply emotional response. And obviously, we're seeing a great deal of it from Palestinian students and from other Arab and Muslim students. We've seen this play out in universities long before Gaza with, demonstrations, hounding speakers on campuses. Some of this has emerged in the past. Some of it is real and it's deeply emotional for people. But to believe that this is just spontaneous, I think is naive.
Well, how much of this, though, really lays at the feet of American progressives who have often looked at, the have-nots are the ones who have the moral high ground. The people of means are the ones who are morally degenerate and are the ones taking advantage of those who are in need and have less. How much of this is progressive ideology that really has influenced a kind of simplistic who wears the black hat, who wears the white hat?
I think that's a very important and valid point. And I think, one can believe simultaneously that Hamas is an evil force that is actually reveling in the deaths of its fellow Gazans and Palestinians because they know it reverberates against Israel. One can believe that what Hamas did was horrific and despicable and utterly inhuman, and at the same time have great sympathy for Palestinians who, let's face it, over many decades have been shunned by virtually everybody, still living in refugee camps many, many decades, 75 years after we had the creation of Israel, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and elsewhere, have never been integrated into those populations, have been mistreated by everybody, and now are facing horrors in Gaza, for many of them that were not caused by them. One can believe all of those things and believe in, what humanity can do in inhumane situations. But what we're seeing is an awful lot of one-sided views of where the blame goes. And that's troubling, and a lot of that is coming from the left.
Nicholas in Santa Monica wants to get back to RFK Jr. and having a third-party candidate. Nicholas wonders, do you think that the RFK Jr. candidacy will draw more from Biden or more from Trump? Is it too early to say? How do you see it?
It may be a little too early to say, but I fear it will draw more from Biden. And remember that a close advisor, a key member of the RFK Jr. campaign, said it out loud and said the goal here was to take votes from Biden to try and throw the election to the House. Now, what happens if the election goes to the House? They vote by state. There are 50 votes, 26 elect a president. The fact is, even if Democrats recapture the majority, it is still likely to be a Republican majority of states because of the preponderance of success in the smaller states, each of which gets the same vote as California, Wyoming, Alaska, one representative, the same vote. So this is an attempt to elect a Republican and to elect Trump. And that, I think, is what RFK has in mind, and I think it's utterly pernicious. And I fear that we're going to see an attempt really to win over more of those progressive votes, probably even making an appeal to older African Americans who still have a picture of Robert F. Kennedy on the mantelpiece because of the role that he played in the early civil rights movement, who may not be making the distinction quite yet. I fear what Kennedy will do.
Jack in Santa Barbara asks, what, if anything, can President Biden do between now and November to energize his base, especially younger voters and Black and Latino voters?
So there are a few things I would like to see the Biden campaign do. First, I want to see a summit in Washington on the threat to democracy in the United States. We need to make this something that is crystal clear to a much larger group of Americans. The president has a bully pulpit. And that means, first, that you showcase those people who worked for Trump, who were inside and saw him up close. Miles Turner, Mark Esper, John Kelly, Mark Milley, if he will do it. People who were a part of the administration who will say, this will be so much worse if he gets reelected. And then bring in the Timothy Snyders and the Ann Applebaums and the scholars and others who have seen what happens as countries slide into dictatorships. Biden has given several eloquent speeches on this. They have a half-life of a half day. You need to do
Okay.
more. The second thing I want to see him do, and he's doing a little bit of this, is I want him to travel to Tennessee and meet with a woman with an ectopic pregnancy where the fetus was clearly going to die and the woman could die. It was completely non-viable, who had to go to 3 hospitals on the verge of death before she'd find one willing to treat her. Go to these red states. Let Greg Abbott and these other red state governors rail against him for being there. And the reason, Larry, is you have to take this threat and personalize it. You have to make it clear that this is not just about abortion. This is about women's health, about freedom more generally, and you don't do that by dealing with it at a 30,000-foot level. You have to deal with it by personalizing it with people who are suffering as a consequence.
We have so many other good questions, John. I just want to work through these sort of lightning round if we can. Joan asks, can you compare 1968 to this? And I would assume in part embedded in that question is the political conventions coming up. Are you concerned?
I'm very concerned on that front because we know that 1968 was Chicago. We know what happened in Chicago. The riots on the streets, the vicious reaction of police, the riots inside the convention hall. We can all, those of us old enough to have been sentient at that time, remember Mayor Daley shouting epithets at Abraham Ribicoff, the senator. We know what that convention did to destroy the hopes of Hubert Humphrey of winning, and that gave us Richard Nixon. We know the Democratic Convention is back in Chicago. It would be amazing if we did not have, first of all, a whole lot of people, whatever's happened in Gaza and Israel by then, who will be there to carry that banner and to hold demonstrations. And I would be stunned if we did not have Proud Boys and others there to instigate violence, to make it look like the Democratic Party has careened out of control. It is a big problem. Now, at the same time, 1968 had its own violent demonstrations and takeovers of buildings on campuses. Columbia, the same building that was taken over that has now been vacated by the NYPD. It was Mark Rudd and the Students for Democratic Society and others, and the police dealt with it then, and people, many of them were jailed as a consequence, and that was a reflection of another reality. You can demonstrate against the war. I demonstrated against the Vietnam War. I suspect you did, and many others on the call did as well. But if you're going to demonstrate and you exercise your free speech, you also have to know that there are consequences if you violate laws.
Lynn says, how can you say that the Republican Party is a cult? How is that not extremism to make a claim like that about one of our 2 political parties?
It is a reality that has been reflected by many core Republicans. And that includes not just Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, but those Republicans who have resigned from Congress or left because they can't stay anymore. And you can look at evidence. I'll give you an example. Rob Portman. Yeah, Rob Portman, senator from Ohio for a long time, House member before that, bipartisan for a period of time, voted pretty much down the line with Trump, with the confirmations of Supreme Court justices, of cabinet members who were corrupt, with all of those legislative accomplishments, announced that he's retiring. No longer has to fear a primary, no longer has to worry about getting another job. He's independently wealthy. Nothing changes because going back home, he didn't want to go to play golf and have people shun him, the people he'd grown up with in Cincinnati. He didn't want to go to dinner. This is
But I think Lynn
there.
would say that's not unusual that you have people in the party, they fall in line behind who the president is, who the leader of the party is. So I think her perspective would be, based on her question, that Trump has that degree of control that whoever a Democratic president has over the Democratic Party.
The Democratic Party has dissenters who do not get death threats as the Secretary of State in Georgia and the governor in Georgia and the other election workers did. The Democratic Party does not have Fred Uptons who vote against their party and then get death threats from people because they have strayed from the orthodoxy. To make that comparison, I think, is simply ludicrous.
One more question before you wrap up, and that is from John in Maryland. If Donald Trump should lose, do you think the Republican Party might turn away from Trumpism?
I'm a little fearful that it will take a significant period of time. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is I've long believed in the rule of three. A party needs to lose 3 elections in a row to begin to realize that the problem is not just a couple of people that they've nominated, but something that's more deep-seated. And because of the nature of midterm elections, I think we're not going to see that happen for a long time. There's a backlash against the party in power. That's what happened to Barack Obama in both 2010 and 2014 as examples. It's what happened to Bill Clinton, which brought in Newt Gingrich, who helped to generate a lot of this. And I'm afraid we're going to see a period of time where we don't have that wake-up call. At the same time, when I'm looking at the farm team, the next category of people ready to move into national politics or run for national office, that's the school boards. We've seen what's happened to them. Getting back to the cult, we're not seeing book banning by one of our parties. At the same time, we've got the state legislatures, the party officials. And what I'm seeing there is the next generation of Republicans going forward make the Freedom Caucus look mild by comparison. It's going to take a while before we get back to what is a genuine party. And that party, I have to say, Larry, it's not going to be a moderate party. It's going to be a very conservative party. It's going to be a Liz Cheney conservative party, but it'll be a problem-solving party. And I'm afraid it's going to be a generation or 2 or more before we get there.
Quickly, 20 seconds. Should Biden debate Trump?
Yes, he's already said that he will. There's a danger, obviously, in that happening, but I think he has to debate.
All right. And just a quick closing comment, Norm, just like 30 seconds. Looking forward, what do you think are the most important political developments to come within the next few weeks?
The trial of Donald Trump is clearly an important one. The Supreme Court, which one will be ruling on whether mifepristone, the pill that is now being sent around that is at least enabling some abortions, will be banned from a lot of places and from a lot of people. And on this immunity case, whether they give Trump more of a free pass or delay it enough that the critical election in Washington on January 6th can't be held before the election.
All right, Norm, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us this evening, talking about the current Republican Party and what you see of it, and Donald Trump's influence on the party, and where you see Republican and independent voters going. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You bet, Larry. And I want to say one last thing, which is,
yes,
over 5 decades, I worked with hundreds of Republicans. I dedicated one of my books to Barbara Conable, a conservative Republican from Rochester, New York. I don't want to see the Republican Party disappear. I want to see it resurrected as a genuine, problem-solving conservative party.
Thank you so much, Norm. I appreciate it. And we ask you please to support these important programs of America at a Crossroads. You can make your tax-deductible contribution, which pays for these programs, 1 or 2 a week. So many of them coming your way now as the briefings on the crisis in Israel continue as well. Please make your contribution at Jews United for Democracy. That's Jews United for Democracy.org, and you can make your tax-deductible contribution then. I also want to let you know that there are 2 programs coming up next week. Monday, for Israel in Crisis Briefing number 13, Ambassador Dennis Ross, who's been a frequent guest on these programs, talks with the LA Times' Pat Morrison. And then 1 week from tonight, Wednesday of next week, political pollsters Celinda Lake and Paul Maslin look at the state of of their profession with Warren Olney. Should be a terrific conversation with much to learn about the state of American political polling from all of us at America at a Crossroads. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.